A twice turned live edge bowl. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today we are going to turn a live edge bowl that has been turned once already and allowed to equalize or dry, and we're going to twice turn it. Yep, you heard me right. We're going to do a twice turned live edge bowl. Now, why would we do this? Well, there's a variety of different reasons, but basically it's so that we have a really nice curved form and we don't have any shrinking after the fact. That's why we do all twice turns. But you don't see it done too often with a live edge bowl because typically live edge bowls are turned once when the wood is green and that's it. And when the wood transforms and shrinks a little bit, it's really not that noticeable with this really interesting organic shape. But when you have a twice turned live edge bowl, the roundness of the live edge bowl can be really nice as well. So that's what we're going to do today. And you can see the tenon on this is distorted quite a bit. You can see how the sides pulled down and it left this ridge in the middle. So we need to retrue the tenon and create the shoulder and then form the sides of the bowl, and then we'll do the interior. So we're basically going to treat this like a standard twice turn bowl, except it's a live edge. So that means we're going to have to take some extra steps to get this back on the lathe. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started and we're going to see what we come up with here. Hopefully we'll keep the bark, but there's no guarantee with that. We'll see what we can do as far as maintaining it. So I'm going to get this on the lathe and let's get started. I'm going to mount this once turned live edge bowl to a jam chuck. Now this is a piece of sycamore that I've shaped to use as a jam chuck. It's not turning perfectly true, so simply take the bowl gouge and round off the front end of this, and that will true it up so we don't have to worry about any wobble coming from the jam chuck. Now I like to keep a relatively flat face on this. That gives plenty of contact with the inside bottom of the bowl. And I'm not really worried about this looking so great. I'm just kind of getting this material out of the way quickly. So I'm going to reverse mount the bowl blank. And I'm going to bring it right up to the previous spot where there's a center mark. And that's going to get me pretty much to true, which is great. I'm going to go ahead and clean up the face of this. This is my 1/2 inch 55 degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I want to continuously tighten this as I'm going because the tailstock will dig into the piece, and as it digs in it'll loosen up the grip, so we want to make sure we're continuously tightening that wheel, especially when we first start off with the turning here. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark the tenon. This initial tenon was turned just a little bit bigger than what I needed it to be, with the anticipation that it would change shape and deform as the bowl blank dried. You want to keep that in mind when you're doing a twice turned. The first turning, you're going to want to make the tenon a little bit larger than normal, because right here you can see we have to reduce this a little bit to get down to the true cylinder for the new tenon that we'll be using. I was noticing there's a little bit of a crown in the center of this face, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this down a little bit as well. Then I'm going to clean up the shoulder. I'm going to pull that in. What happens when we do a green turning like this is the sides of the bowl pull in. The end grain pretty much stays in the same location, but the sides of the bowl pull inward, and that creates this curvature. Here you can actually see, because of the rotation of the lathe and the way the camera is picking up, you see the dark spot going around. That's an area that hasn't been hit. So there I'm cutting, here I'm not cutting, that's lower, and here I'm cutting, and on the opposite side I'm not cutting. So I'm not down to a true surface yet. So I need to keep turning until I get down to that true lower surface. But I don't want to do this very quickly. I want to make light passes. Don't want to get too aggressive with this. Now what's nice about this is black cherry, and it turns very smoothly. It reminds me of almost ceramic or porcelain. It has a really nice, clean, almost solid feel and texture to it. And if I take my time and I make the cuts really intentional and light and clean here, I have very little sanding to do. That's what's nice about this particular species. Here you can see those darker areas disappearing because we're going down just a little bit lower to get below those. So now I'm cutting all the way around. So as this bowl is turning, I'm making a cut continuously. Before I was cutting on one side, the lower side would go underneath the gouge, and then I'm cutting. You can see how smooth this is. Look how clean that cut is. It's actually slicing through the bark very cleanly too, which is great. It looks really, really nice. As you can see, I need to continue that up to the rim. So what I'm going to do here is a technique I use when I'm doing greenwood turnings as well, is I'm actually going against the supported grain cut here. And the supported grain cut's really important to understand. I've got a video all about the supported grain cut. You're going to want to check that out if you're not familiar with it. It will actually change the way you turn overnight, because there's a good chance if you're making unsupported grain cuts, you're going to have some issues. But here, I'm intentionally going against the supported grain just to make sure that bark stays intact. And I'm finding that it's actually doing okay, but I am tearing out some of those ingrained fibers. So I'm going to make a really light pass going with the supported grain here. But as you can see, I'm going in a direction that would, if I'm not careful, I can just push that bark right off the end of the rim of the bowl, especially at the top of those wings. So I want to go very slowly and make very light passes here. You do not want to get aggressive here because you will tear out the bark for sure. And we don't want that. We want to try to maintain that bark rim if we can. Now, if for some reason the bark breaks off, that's okay. We can go around and take all the bark off and then sand down to the cambium layer, or just past the cambium layer right down to the sapwood, and it'll still look good. It's not quite as interesting as when it does have the bark intact. So the bark's looking good. There's some tool marks there. It's very common to get tool marks on the wings of the bowl, both on the exterior like here and on the interior. I'm using my larger 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And the reason I'm using it here is that the wings can be used for a shear scrape. And the shear scrape is a great way to smooth out any of those tool marks and just erase them. I like to call this the magic eraser for wood turning. I've got a video all about the shear scrape. You might want to check that out. If you're not already using the shear scrape, this is the best way to clean up these areas. If I were to make another push cut, I would most likely remove too much material, and I would probably simply add more tool marks. And if you keep doing that over and over again, you're going to be reducing the overall size of your bowl, and you don't want to do that. So instead, just lightly shave and smooth out the areas where you're having trouble. And you can see how thin and light those shavings are coming off the gouge. So I want to make sure I've got everything squared up from the base of the bowl all the way up to the rim. And I want to clean that up. I want to take my time and really clean that up. You can see I'm using the lower wing here. I am not cutting. This is actually not a supported grain cut. It's more of a shave. Now I've switched over to my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I also have the heel ground back a little bit. That makes the overall height of the bevel a little bit narrower, as you can see here. That allows me to get this particular tool in this configuration into a little bit tighter corners. Now that's really more important when we're doing the interior, but it also works pretty well here at this bottom edge. So you can see the overall shape. I've got a couple high spots. It's not curved exactly the way I'd like it, so I'm kind of working those high spots and really paying attention to making this one fluid continuous curve around the exterior of the bowl. You can see me tipping my head up. I'm looking at the top edge of the bowl while I'm turning to make sure that I'm hitting the areas I need. And I see there's a little bit of a high spot there. Now another great technique is to use a pencil and mark the area. Now this is pretty subtle. You almost don't see it in the video here, but it's a very subtle high spot there. You can feel it, and it's just not quite right. The transition to make the exterior of the bowl very smooth isn't quite complete with that area. So I've marked it with the pencil. That way I can easily tell when the lathe's running where I need to be focused. So I'm just lightly doing a shear scrape over that area. And as I start, obviously I'm going to scrape away those pencil marks, but I'm also taking that high spot down at the same time, and I'm making the curve nice and smooth the way I need it to be. All right, that's looking really good. Okay, so now I'm going to apply the angle on the dovetail. Now the reason I leave this to the very end is that if for some reason this blank would shift at all in the lathe, and the last turnings that I just did with the shear scrape, those were true. That means the lathe was turning nice and smooth and true. Well, I want to make this, finalize this tenon now, because everything will be lined up and turned true at the same time. Had I done this tenon earlier and something moved, the tenon might not be quite trued up to what I just did at the very end of this turning. With the exterior complete, I'm going to go ahead and turn this blank around, and I'm using the same chuck. So basically I just remove the jam chuck and then mount the tenon into the chuck itself. And as you can tell there, that tenon is not seated in the bottom of the tenon. That's really important to understand. You really want to make a great tenon connection, and I've got lots of videos on the tenons. Check those out, or look through my playlist and search for tenon, because I have several videos about the tenon. If you're not already subscribing to this channel, please consider subscribing, and go ahead and click that subscribe button and click the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I have new videos that come out, and I've got plenty of videos in the pipeline you're not going to want to miss. Okay, I'm using my 1/2" 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge now, and I'm very carefully making push cuts parallel with the exterior of the bowl to establish the wall thickness of this bowl. Now what's happening is I'm starting the edge and then I'm rotating. Now the pivot point isn't quite at the tool rest, it's just behind the tool rest. But these cuts, I'm essentially pulling my right hand back. I'm applying down pressure with my left hand, and my right hand is the rudder control, essentially. I'm controlling the rotation of the bowl gouge by pulling with my right arm and pulling the curve as it comes around. Here, I'm looking down on the tool rest, and I'm matching the bevel of the bowl gouge to the exterior of the bowl. I'm making sure the two are parallel with one another. That way, I'm assured that the wall will be evenly thick throughout. So you can see I'm progressing a little bit closer to the edge here. It's kind of hard to see the way the camera is recording it, but I'm making this a little bit thinner, and I'm establishing that wall thickness, and I'm making this cut very intentional, applying down pressure and gently moving into the bowl. You don't want to rush this process. You want to take your time and make sure that you're making each cut very intentional. And then I slowly and gradually work down the interior of the bowl, matching up that wall thickness with the previous area as I go. I have found this is the best way to be very intentional about maintaining an even wall thickness on your bowl. So I'll take a little bit of time and I'll remove material to get down to that, close to that thickness. And as you can see, I was doing that a little quicker because it's a roughing technique. Essentially, I'm just roughing and getting that material out. But here, when I get close to the wall thickness, I slow down and get very precise. I have the gouge flute rotated open here, and that's a very delicate cut. You want to make sure it's a very light cut you're doing. You don't want to get a catch. Everything's looking great there. It feels smooth. I feel the wall thickness is even from top to bottom. Exactly what I'm looking for. So I'll proceed, remove a little more material and work down that interior wall just a little bit farther. So you can see here, I slow down dramatically when I get out or down to the final thickness, and then I go back a bit and just make sure that that gouge is rubbing and merging with the previous layer, and then take that down. Now here I'm using my fingers to check the wall thickness. My tool needs to be sharpened, so I'm just going to run back over to the sharpening station. Now, if you need to learn how to sharpen your tools, I've got an online course called Tool Sharpening where we go over sharpening tools, but we also go over how to shape tools. I highly recommend learning how to sharpen your tools properly even before learning to turn. If you're just getting started with turning and you learn how to sharpen your tools first, you're going to have so much more success and things are going to be that much easier for you down the road. Now I'm going to switch to my inside curved tool rest. This gives me a little bit more support and it fits the curved shape of this particular bowl, and it's going to work out really well. And I'm going to proceed down just like I was before. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatically different. I'm just going to rough this material. And you can see here I'm making these cuts a little bit quicker. This is, again, roughing cuts to get down to that base layer or down to the inside wall layer. And when I get to that wall layer, I'm going to be turning a lot more slowly and intentionally. Now, I'm going to mark this tape. I'm moving this tape here, and I'm checking the edges of this bowl. I use that tape as a rough guide because it's really hard to see where the edge of that bowl is going to be. And I don't want to bring my hand up to that because while I have yet to do that, I can only imagine that it would hurt. And we just don't need to do that. So anyway, I use that tape to be a marker to let me know how far I can get my hand into this bowl. Some of the deeper bowls, it becomes a little bit tricky because to turn safely, you really need to use a longer tool or a different tool so that your hand is not anywhere near the edge of the bowl. If you're liking this video, I'd really appreciate it if you click that like button. Thank you. Now that we're down to the surface, you can see how much slower I'm turning. Or rather, my pace is slowed. The turning itself and the rotation of the lathe is the same, but the pace of the gouge is much slower because I want to make a really clean pass here. I don't want to get aggressive. I don't want to tear out fibers. Now I'm going to start removing material in the inside center all the way down and across the center. Each one of these passes is a great opportunity to practice how your final pass will be. Because I have limited support with the tool, I can't really get my hand in there and push down on the tool rest to get good support because my hand will be inside the bowl and I've got that bark edge going around. If this were a round rim bowl, I wouldn't have a problem putting my hand in there a little bit more, because essentially I would just rub the edge or the rim of the bowl if I came in contact with it. With this, I've got two wings that are flying around there, and if you get smacked with one of those, it's going to hurt and it's going to damage the bowl most likely. So I have to depend on the tool rest, and that's why this curved tool rest is so valuable right now. Is I have good contact with the tool rest, just maybe 1.5 inches or maybe 35 millimeters away from the surface of the bowl. Normally I would have my left hand up right near that tool rest, pushing down on the bowl gouge to give it extra support. Now I move back and I check. I can still see from my point of view that this is looking a little flat in the bottom. It's not, the curve is not following. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up. I'm going to start a very light cut and just taper and slowly bring that down into the bottom so that I'm removing a little bit more material in the bottom area here and following the overall curve of the interior of the bowl. You do not want to get aggressive here. You want to take your time, go nice and slow, let the tool do the cutting. Now you can see that flat area in the bottom, not just the small part, but the part that's just below that. And I'm getting a little vibration with my 1/2 inch gouge, so I'm going to switch to my 5/8 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, and I'm going to let that. It's not typically what I use for finishing, but if I slow down my cut pace here, I can finish that up nicely. Now I do have a little bit of bark that is trying to break off here, but it's still holding on. So I'm going to use some spray lacquer, and I'm going to spray that around the edges of that. Now the reason I sprayed the lacquer is to prevent this CA glue from staining the wood. The lacquer creates almost like a seal on the surface, and then I can apply the CA and glue that piece of bark back into place nicely without creating a big glue stain mark on the edge of the bowl. So I'm going to take my time and I'm going to sand the entire exterior and interior of this. This other thing that's nice about doing a twice turn bowl is the wood is nice and dry. You can sand it all the way down to your finished sanding grit, and it's ready for finish at that point. Here you can see, like I mentioned before, you're almost always going to get tool marks on the wings of the bowl, both on the outside and the inside. But if you take your time and go around, you can easily erase those tool marks as you sand. Now I'm starting with 120 grit paper, and I'm working around. I'm working around in the grain of the bowl from top to bottom. So I start when I'm on the inside, I'll start at the top edge. I'll erase any of those tool marks or any scratches, and I'll keep rotating the bowl by hand and then work down into the bottom of the bowl until I'm sanded one grit all the way through on one side. And then I'll switch. Now I go from 120 to 180 to 220. Now I'm stopping at 220 grit for this particular piece because I'm using shellac, and then I'm going to put a coat of lacquer or multiple coats of lacquer over this. And the tooth of the 220 grit actually helps both the shellac and the lacquer grip the wood better. And lacquer has the ability to float across rough areas and smooth itself out. So you don't have to sand down crazy fine detail like to 400 grit when you're doing lacquer. So I'm not going to do all of the lacquer steps in this particular video, but what I'm doing is I'm applying shellac right now. Now this is homemade shellac. I've got a video all about shellac. If you want to check that out, it's pretty interesting. You can make your own shellac very easily just by purchasing shellac flakes, and you can use either denatured alcohol, methylated alcohol, or in this case I'm using pure grain alcohol, which is a 200 proof corn alcohol. Now I got this from a restaurant supplier, and they sell it as a solvent or a cleaning agent. Now I'm going to let that layer or that coat dry on the lathe, and that's going to be it for now. Now I will sand that shellac layer again before I start applying lacquer, but it's going to become a really nice base coat to let the lacquer shine quickly when I start applying the lacquer to it. So we need to reverse mount this. Now, if you notice, the first time I mounted this on the jam chuck, I didn't use a pad in there. Well, that was because the whole inside of the bowl was rough and there was nothing to really protect. Right now we have the inside finished and I have the shellac applied to it, so I don't want to scuff up that and create like a ring or anything like that from the jam chuck. That's why I use that real thin piece of foam padding between the bowl itself and the jam chuck. It just provides a little extra protection and prevents the jam chuck from scratching the inside of the bowl. So I'm shaping the outside of the foot of the bowl, and that's a combination of the tenon and the shoulder are now going to become the foot of the bowl. Which, by the way, this is why I love turning tenons, because you have so many options at this point. You get to decide how you want this piece to look. You can shape that foot in any number of different ways. I can make it shorter, taller, I can make it narrower. I can do so many different things that I can't do when I do a recessed mortise. And that's one of the main reasons I really enjoy turning tenons. And actually, I've got a video all about that too you might want to check out. I'm going to take my time and clean that area up, and I'm going to go ahead and sand that nicely so it's nice and smoothed out, and I will apply shellac to that area as well before applying the finished lacquer later.
But yeah, shellac is actually really easy to make yourself, and when you make it yourself, there's no other additives in it that are going to further diminish the quality of your final finish. This way you know you have just shellac that's being applied to the bowl and nothing else. It's actually pretty fun to make too. Very simple, and it's kind of satisfying to have your own finish that you make yourself. Now, I want the foot of this bowl, or the ring that makes up the foot of the bowl, to be roughly the same proportion as the wall thickness. And I want that inside foot, or the inside area around the bowl foot, to essentially be an extension of the curve of the exterior of the bowl. So if I were to remove that foot or that ring somehow magically, just pull it off of there shouldn't be any change in surface. You should see just a continuous curving bottom shape of the bowl, kind of like the calabash bowl that I turned a while back. If you had a chance to see the calabash bowl, there's no ringed foot on that at all. It's just a continuous curve that goes through the bottom of the bowl. That's really what you want the shape or the design of your bowl to have. I'm being very careful here because I have that flute wide open and I'm just being very precise where it's contacting. If I accidentally contact too much material, I'm going to get a catch and it'll probably throw this right off the lathe, and we don't want that. I've had several bowls come off the lathe in my time, and usually the round rim bowls are okay. They might have a little dent or scratch somewhere, but you get a live edge bowl come off the lathe, it will probably not end well because one of those wings is going to get damaged, if not both of them. So we keep turning this nub away. Now I'm going to switch over to my spindle detail gouge to get in there and get a little bit more precise and take more material off. Now you could stop right now and cut this off or sand it down. It's going to be a little bit of work to sand that all the way down. Instead, I like to get in here with the spindle detail gouge and just work that nub down slowly. Another big thing here is don't turn the lathe on or off at this point. That nub is so narrow that the torque of turning on the lathe or having it come to a stop can cause it to break. And as soon as we lose integrity with that nub, we have no way of turning this true. So I'm going to apply forward pressure and turn the lathe off. And it didn't quite sever it here, so I'm going to turn this by hand while I'm pushing in with the gouge, and that cut it off. Just pull that off, and then I'll sand that center area nice and clean. And there's our bowl. So there it is. Again, once the final finish is put on, it's going to look a lot better, but look at the grain in there. It's actually a gorgeous piece, and it's not symmetrical, which I kind of like. The base mount is centered well, but each of the wings is just a little bit different. It makes it very unique. I'm very, very happy with this piece.
Well, here it is, a twice turned live edge bowl. I think it turned out rather nice. Now, the big advantage and the main reason for doing a twice turned bowl is so that you have a perfectly stable final turning. That means this wood is equalized or dry. Now, there's no such thing as dry wood. We learn all about that in the Treatable Understanding Green Wood course. You might want to check that out. It's a great way to quickly learn how to use raw wood to make bowls. What's happening here is this wood is equalized. That means it's not going to shrink or deform or reshape very much at all, at least not that we're going to be able to perceive. And it's definitely not going to have the sides pull in like it would if this were wet green wood. Now, typically a once turned live edge bowl is fine. The biggest issue you're going to have is with the foot shaping over time. As that piece dries, the sides are going to pull up, so you're going to have this wobbly base, and you're going to need to sand that base to make it flat again. Now, I've got a video all about how to make a sander for your lathe. You might want to check that out, and that's a great way, and one of the ways that you can make that base nice and flat again. But because this piece has been twice turned and it's equalized, I don't have to worry about this base distorting over time. It's going to stay nice and flat and true. And all in all, I think this turned out really nice. Now, I wish I could have applied all of the finish to this to show you guys, but it's going to take a lot longer. I'm going to experiment actually with some new techniques that I'm learning for lacquer. And if all goes well, this is going to be a beautiful, really shiny finished piece when it's done. Now I use the shellac for this to be kind of like a sealer or a base coat. It also makes it a lot easier for the lacquer to start shining quicker. If you don't apply some type of sealer like the shellac, then it takes many coats of lacquer before you start building up that shine, because the lacquer's got to fill in all those pores as well. But the shellac does it really quickly. The other advantage of the shellac is it acts as an adhering agent, and if there's any loose areas in this bark layer, it'll help adhere those and pull those together and keep them nice and snug. But the bark is actually in really good shape with this. I'm really amazed by that. There were little issues up here on the top, but that's pretty typical. So all in all, I think it's a pretty nice piece. Let me know what you think. Leave me a comment below and let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if you're going to twice turn a live edge bowl, or if you've done that already. Also, if you haven't already, please click that like button. It helps this video, helps the channel, and I greatly appreciate you for doing that. Thank you. Check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got everything you need to know about turning wood bowls. So check it out, turnawoodbowl.com. All right, guys, like always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy turning. A twice edge live turn. A twice edge live.